How you doing, everybody? It's Wardy here, and as you can see, we're back at it, breaking down the latest in Mets land. And we have some key reports to get into for our second video of the day. Our first came out a little bit earlier on the latest with the Mets having trade negotiations, at least talks amongst themselves on the topic of Ryan Mountcastle from the Baltimore Orioles. Spencer Torkelson is not the only first base trade target the Mets have had in mind, and we broke that down along with the Mets' continued pursuit of lefty reliever Tim Hill, all thanks to our amazing friend here on the platform, Pat Ragazzo, who joined us in a live segment last night. So highly implore you all to check that out in case you guys haven't. Pat has been doing a fantastic job on the beat for the Mets as of late there with affiliate through Sports Illustrated. And we have more to get into from Ragazzo's reporting today, stating how the Mets are still active on the starting pitching front. To what degree is what we'll get into, everybody, along with, yes, exactly why you clicked on this video. Steve Cohen is back in the Alonso market, just 48 hours removed from those famous blunt and certainly brutally honest remarks said by Cohen himself, which I heard myself there at the Amazing Fan Fest over this past weekend. Come to find out, he's now back in the Alonso market with himself and Boris. We'll get into to what degree, where the reporting stems from, and everything in between. So make sure to smash that like and subscribe on as you first chime in. Thank you guys so much for doing exactly that. And shout out to our amazing sponsor, as always, at BetUS, which has you covered with all your sports betting needs, everybody. But folks, let's first get into the initial reactions in the comments down below, because this has been an active public negotiation, a messy one for sure, and certainly one that, if this is really going to lead to a divorce, has not been one that's been smooth sailing by any stretch of the imagination. This one has had all the messiness having to do with one man, or at least one side of the group here, not being loyal to each other, which is why things have been in the public eye as aired out as they've been. And Steve Cohen, again, being as an anomaly of an owner as he's been since the start, doing unprecedented things like what we just heard at the Fan Fest, being brutally honest that he hates these negotiations. These are far more difficult than the Juan Soto ones, and he is really not happy at all with the structures that are coming back to him on contract offers, saying how they're asymmetrical, certainly in favor of Alonso's camp, but not in favor of the Mets whatsoever. And for there to be that drastic of a lopsidedness is telling that certainly Steve is frustrated as someone who wants to bring back Alonso, because Cohen wouldn't be breaking a sweat here or frustrated at all to the imagination, at least to us Mets fans, certainly to how pronounced it's been at this point, if he didn't actually care and want to bring Pete home. It is clear as day that the Mets want Alonso back, but at their price. They have the hard line in the sand, as is the case with Alonso being equally as stubborn with wanting things at his price point and closer to his range there on a mid to long-term deal, which is something that he's simply not getting right now. And these reports initially stem, as you guys can see, from John Heyman of the New York Post earlier today, that you guys can see the following quote: no more than 48 hours after publicly lamenting the seemingly I can't even pronounce right now, I'm sorry, seemingly endless saga, and we see there of the booze going on with David Stearns, Steve Cohen, yada yada yada, Cohen was back in conversation with Alonso's camp. So to what degree are those conversations at the moment? That's something that I'd imagine that we're going to find out more about in the next 24 hours easily. Every single day that Alonso's not signed, we inch closer to him signing, even if it has been as much of a drag as it's certainly been at this point, as we're just a couple of days away from February already. But when it comes to this Alonso saga and where we have found ourselves, this comes from the latest report from John Heyman of the New York Post, which initially stems from the following article that he came out with, and I highly implore you guys to check it out. If you guys are subscribed to the New York Post Plus there, that you guys can check out this one that has a paywall, which is, here's an idea for the Mets we should all get behind, and here's why. And it just has to do with Francisco Lindor, why he needs to be captain, and I wholeheartedly agree with that, but that feels like common knowledge as well, and we all fully expect Lindor to officially be named captain for the Mets at some point sooner rather than later, considering it hasn't happened yet. But back on the Alonso front here, the other most notable thing out of this piece regarding Alonso from John Heyman is that even Francisco Lindor obviously is going to bat for Alonso, is certainly having his input in saying on how much he wants to see Pete return back to Queens. We heard that furthermore from the Amazing Fan Fest over this past weekend, which was an absolute blast. Thank you guys so much to everyone that I interacted with, to literally so many of you guys, and I had an absolute blast. It was truly nothing short of amazing, and yes, pun was certainly intended there. But a real back in on Alonso here and where things stand, the negotiation negotiations continue. What we knew lastly was that Alonso had approached the Mets with an exclusive 3-year offer around 3 years, $90+ million, including a first-year opt-out at least. The Mets countered 3 years, $70+ million, with deferred payments probably pushing it closer to $80 million, with an opt-out after that first and or second year. Alonso declined, and since declining, the Mets have taken that offer off the board, off the table, according to Will Salmon of The Athletic, who's done a great job in his own right on the beat for the Mets there, as is Pat Regazzo. All these people on the beat as of late, especially between himself, Tim Healy too, they have all been doing a tremendous job all off season long. But as we reel in on especially Alonso and Steve on the current status of these negotiations, we know that spring training is right around the corner. Pitchers and catchers are going to be reporting before we know it over the next couple weeks. So does Alonso really want this to drag out at all deep into spring training? We know it's only going to hurt him more than anyone else. The Mets can comfortably start spring training without Alonso because they know that they can also try to pull off a trade for a Ryan Mountcastle, for Spencer Torkelson that we touched on greatly in our video earlier today. Check it out in case you guys haven't already, because those are things that they're not hot commodities where teams are absolutely chomping out of the bit in dire need for them. There are very few teams in the game right now that are in need of a first baseman the way that the Mets are in need one right now. So if we find ourselves getting into spring training and Alonso finds actually in a destination that isn't with the Mets, then okay, I think the Mets will pounce. But they're not going to wait terribly long before making sure that they have their roster to the best of their abilities for 2025. But they have won a level of comfortability, at least considering Vientos to begin spring training there. And if it doesn't work, then they can really defer to trading for one of Mountcastle and Torkelson if they hadn't done that already. And two, in the case of Alonso, this is in similarity to JD Martinez last year. Just because the Mets have an initial approach heading into spring training without a player doesn't mean that the approach won't drastically change with them acquiring said player. Mark Vientos was the slam dunk guarantee to be the Mets starting DH up until what we saw JDM sign with the Mets there in spring training. Vientos then gets his reps to the hot corner, and the rest is history. If Alonso finds himself still unsigned as we get into the latter half of February and the beginning of these spring training games, I assure you it will not be too much longer before he inevitably makes his decision here. He doesn't want this to drag out too much longer than it already has. It's bothered him enough, I'm sure. And for him and his marketability, he's only going to sign for a short to mid-level contract right now with a likelihood of him opting out after the first season here in 2025 if he has a big year, say batting behind Soto, or if he has a big year elsewhere, which it's hard to envision that being the case, but I'll give him a benefit of the doubt as of now. If Alonso, say, signs in Toronto, maybe he will have success with Santander, with Vladdy, and what is a batter's park there for half the season there in Toronto. I certainly like how he can play up there in that dome, but for Alonso, getting adjusted already in this spring training with a team he's never even been a part of, I could see there being obstacles in the way, and it's certainly how we saw that kind of cloud looming over him. What was a very underwhelming 2024 campaign in his walk year, led by Scott Boras. I would foresee that to be the case again, especially if he's on a different club and in a new clubhouse for the first time. But I digress. You guys know very well how I feel on the front of Alonso. I want him back. I understand why the Mets have a hard line in the sand, and I have confidence in the Mets and how they're going to operate about things going forward. But if they lose Alonso, it goes without saying you need to make an external move. It is not enough to stay in-house, in my humble opinion, with Vientos and Beatty. Not a slight on Brett, and maybe Brett will blossom the way that Vientos did it this past year, where he shows not only defensive upside, but that offensive prowess that could really have him as an everyday player. But he hasn't proven that yet, and the Mets need to make sure that they have their best roster to their ability heading into this 2025 season with Juan Soto. By having Vientos and Beatty, I think it's going to be underwhelming to many fans, including myself, when if you acquire a Mountcastle or a Torkelson or something else that we haven't discussed at this point, that'll give them certainly more flexibility and more upside there to keep Vientos at his true position there on the hot corner should David Stearns like his ability to continue to work on his defense there and have some upside in these younger guys with some years of control, whether it's 2 years in the case of Mountcastle, 4 in the case of Torkelson, or someone else, as I allude to, that maybe we haven't talked about at this point in time. But Mets fans, I definitely want to know how you guys feel on the latest with the Alonso sweepstakes between himself, Scott Boras, and Steve Cohen, because we all know Scott in many ways has screwed Alonso in these negotiations. Not that Alonso has been at fault, because he's at fault for denying the Mets contract extension a year and a half ago. He's at fault for really dragging things the way that he has to a degree. But where Scott Boras comes into play is how he approaches Steve Cohen and these markets, and really has what is an above average player viewed as something greater than that, which is why Alonso has fallen in the same category as guys like Matt Chapman, Blake Snell, and Jordan Montgomery, all having in common those recent Scott Boras clients that overplay their hand in the free agent market looking for long-term deals, couldn't get it, had to settle for short-term high AV with opt-outs, and looking to likely opt out the first year after that first year in that deal to likely get some more dollars if that can happen. Work for Snell, work for Chapman, didn't work for Monty right now. The D-backs hate it because of that reason, and now we're going to see what happens with Alonso, and is the case here with Alex Bregman, who everything that we heard to this point, the Mets are like officially out on the Alonso Bregman front, but all it takes is for Alex Bregman front, but all it takes is for Alonso to sign elsewhere, and then bam, the Mets may pivot to Bregman for all we know to prioritize that hot corner defense, and then allow Vientos to get full-on reps at first base. That isn't out of the realm of possibility, but again, one of those things that we'll have to kind of see it to believe it at this point in time. But now, folks, going from the Pete Alonso talks, let's get into the pitching talks, because right away, as many of you guys know, we had Pat Ragazzo in our live stream last night, and I asked him on the Mets pitching options, not only on Michael Cain via trade, but also what we've heard on Jack Flaherty, Nick Pivetta. Come to find out from our guy Pat today, he comes out with a great piece highlighting how the Mets are still monitoring the starting pitching market, and Jack Flaherty and Nick Pivetta obviously make plenty of sense for them. I highlighted this in a video a couple days ago, so check that out, guys, in case you haven't already. I'm not going to be too long-winded here, and I'm not really going to talk about Pivetta much, because until we find out that Alonso signed elsewhere, the Mets are really not likely to sign Pivetta because he has that qualifying offer attached to him. They'd have to give up their 3rd and 6th round picks for him. They're not comfortable doing that more than likely. That's why he's been out on the market so long, because Boston kind of screwed him for him to decline that offer, which he was likely not going to accept to begin with. But now Pivetta, what can really balance out is if the Mets lose out on Alonso, then they can just utilize that qualified offer pick and allocate that towards Pivetta should they go and acquire him then. And then it kind of offsets in that sense. But again, only makes sense if Alonso truly goes elsewhere, which we don't know at this point in time. And I've been steadily under the belief that Alonso will circle back to the Mets when everything's said and done. So I'm not shocked to see that Cohen is back in the market having active negotiation with Pete and Boras at this point in time. But Jack Flaherty is the most fascinating one in this free agent market, in my opinion, because Flaherty is a guy that has the highest upside, where he could be, again, easily a 1, 2, or 3 starter for you when he's at his absolute best. He has playoff experience, even though Pete Alonso rocked him in Game 5 of the NLCS, and is absolutely a guy that is a bit more of a soft tosser, so you can have concerns at times. But Flaherty really did impress a lot this past season, and that should be understated. That's why you guys see the numbers down below for Jack, and he's coming off of a year's playing time with both the Detroit Tigers and the LA Dodgers, where he ultimately won the World Series with, as a guy that can be an immediate impact for any team having the luxury to acquire him on a short-term high AV offer, with potentially an opt-out after the first and or second seasons. I think anywhere in the 1 to 3 range is absolutely something the Mets should heavily consider, especially 1 to 2 high AV. I don't think the AV should matter in an instance like this. Just do whatever you need to do to get another starter. The Mets are rolling with a 6-man, as we know. By adding Flaherty, you really do have more stability there with Kodai Senga, Sean Manaea, David Pearson. Jack Flaherty as your 1 through 4 is nothing to scoff at. Then your number 5 is Clay Holmes. Your number 6 is Frankie Montas, in no particular order here. Then Griffin Canning, Tyler McGill, Paul Blackburn, really on the outside looking in, and that's exactly what you want. You want the Mets to have as much depth as possible, but have a good balance of guys that can be a 1 through 3 starter for you, versus guys that are probably at best going to peak as a 4 for you, and more so in the back end in the 4 to 6 range, right? So when it comes to a guy like Jack Flaherty, the Mets did show interest in him earlier this offseason. There hasn't been too much active negotiation that we know at this point in time, but the Mets are in fact still shopping the pitching market, which I've been led to believe, which is why they've shown a level of interest in Max Scherzer on a 1-year contract that Pat Ragazzo separately reported on over this past week. Check that out in previous content on the platform in case you guys haven't already as well. But Flaherty certainly fits the mold for this team with a 3. Roughly 2 ERA this past season, a 3.10 SI ERA, just over a 1 WHIP, a fantastic K to walk ratio, a 10.8 K per 9 to a 2.1 walks per 9 there, so right around an 8 K to walk ratio, which I love. And as you guys can see even from his Savant numbers this season, They're pretty strong. We're looking the 98th percentile and breaking run value because that's how good his breaking pitches have been. 53rd in pitching run value, 53rd in fastball run value, 63rd in pitching run value, by the way. I misspoke there. 51st there in off-speed run value, so all above league average. 70th in expected ERA, 58th in expected batting average. Low in fastball velocity, but that doesn't really matter because he's 62nd in average exit velocity, 72nd in chase percentage, 91st in whip percentage, 90th in K percentage, 83rd in walk percentage, right around league average in barrel percentage, 74th in hard hit percentage. Not a ground ball pitcher, and that's fine. Is 67th in extension. The four-seam slider, curve change, and sinker mix has really been the big one for him. That fastball can be a meatball for sure, but where he makes up for it is that slider and curve. He gets a lot of bite there, especially with that slider out of the zone there. It has a lot of nice late movement on it, which is why you find him again in the 90th plus percentiles there and the K and whip percentage. So Jack Flaherty, for a guy that isn't known for the high velocity and has dealt with some ailments in recent years, so there is some injury risk for sure, and investing in someone like him. But if you're going to do a short-term high AAV, especially for a guy who at least knows what it takes to win, even if he himself was a massive contributor for the Dodgers, more lack thereof obviously versus some of their other pitchers over this past run, still a very solid starter with some strong upside for the Mets. When you look at their other options, both the free agent and trade market, there aren't many others that kind of fit the bill better now for what the Mets would have to give up, which is just money on a short-term basis. And I really think this would bode well for him as well to enter Citi Field, which is a pitcher's park, for at least half the season there, juice his numbers, and look for a longer-term contract with the likelihood that he opts out after, say, a deep run with the Mets in 2025. So Jack Flaherty, add him to this Mets rotation is what I have to say about that, folks. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below on Flaherty, on Alonso, on Cohen, and on all the latest topics here in Mets land. And thank you guys again for watching. If you enjoyed the Mets content, make sure to smash that like and subscribe on your way out. Help us get to our next subscriber goal of 32,000 subscribers. We just gave away a Juan Soto Met shirt jersey there to one lucky winner because that's the player that he selected after hitting 31K. And at 30K, we gave away an actual Juan Soto jersey. So we're doing giveaways after every 1,000 milestone that we hit on the platform of new subscribers. Join the community now if you haven't already. Thank you so much in advance. And let's go Mets, baby. Peace out.